Hello again and welcome back to the PhatPhish Guitar Studio. I'm Dave and in this video we're going to be talking about tremolo systems. I've had a few conversations the past week or so about guitar hardware and different types of gear that comes actually fitted to the guitar, so I thought it was quite a good subject for a video. We've got a few guitars here with different types of tremolo systems on, so I thought look at the different types and kind of explain the differences between them, how you can set them up, get the most out of them, and most importantly help you select which would be the best type for you, because it's quite easy to get sort of a tremolo system that's not going to be suited to your style of music, and the guitar's actually going to end up holding you back. I know you shouldn't blame your tools, but it is possible to make some bad choices. Okay, let's get started. Okay, I'm going to jump in here and be slightly pedantic for a minute. In this video we're talking about these units called tremolos, or trems for short. The effect you get from one of these units is not tremolo. Tremolo is a variation in volume of a note. The effect you get from one of these is actually vibrato, which is the change in pitch. But for whatever reason, when they first introduced these units, they called them tremolos, and the name just kind of stuck. So for all the effect that you're getting from it is not tremolo, it's vibrato. I'm going to call them tremolo units because that's kind of what they're called, even if it isn't what they do. Okay, so this first tremolo system here is what's called a Bigsby system on this Epiphone Wildcat. It's fairly old design, probably dates back about the 50s, I think. It's a rock and roll era thing, so it's not about heavy metal, extreme dive bombing or anything like that. It's just a nice subtle vibrato unit. Reasonably simple layout, everything's on top of the guitar so you can see how it works, and we'll take a close look in a second. The principle behind this is the same as all the tremolo systems we're going to be taking a look at in this video, in that you've got the bar here which you can push down or pull up to make the tremolo system either work with or fight against the tension in the strings. So if I just play a chord and push the bar down, it lowers the tension in the strings and get a lower note, and then as I take my hand off, the strings kind of pull everything back to tension and the strings return to pitch. And I can also pull the trem back slightly to raise the pitch of the strings. Like I say, it's quite a subtle effect, more just about vibrato than anything extreme. Okay, let's just take a closer look at this. So the Bigsby system's fairly simple. The string ball ends go through these little pins coming out here, around this roll, this bar, and under here and along. You've got this spring here, which is what's controlling where the tremolo arm is, and as I push the arm down, basically it rotates that bar here, strings move forward and the tension of the string goes down, and then that spring pushes the tremolo arm back and returns the strings to pitch. Not a whole lot to adjust on here. It's simple, but it works quite well. Okay, so the Bigsby tremolo system, it does what it does very well, but like I say, it's an older type of design. It's possibly not as versatile as some of the other systems that you can get. Let's take a look at something else that also had its origins in the 50s, but it's still very much around today and gets very heavily used, and that's the Strat Trem. Okay, so back with this, it's a rather nice Fender Custom Shop 1955 Stratocaster, and it's got what's often referred to as a Strat Trem, because this type of trem was first introduced with the Fender Stratocaster back in 1954, and still on Fender Strats to this day, and a whole bunch of other types of guitar besides, because it's a really good piece of design. The design of this, it's been tweaked a little bit over the years, but to be honest, Leo Fender got it pretty much right first time, and it just works. It's got a bit more to it in terms of range than the Bigsby, but the basic principle is the same. You've got the tension in the strings counterbalanced or working with some springs. Now, unlike the Bigsby that had the spring on the top of the guitar, the Strat has got some springs inside the body. At this point I'm going to cut to a piece of video that I shot earlier for something else, rather than getting screwdrivers and taking backplate off this guitar. But as you can see, springs inside the body that are counterbalancing the tension in the strings. So this vintage Strat Trem has a lot more adjustability than what we saw in the Bigsby. We've got 6 screws down here. These fix the the tremolo plate to the guitar. They're not adjustable. What is adjustable though is the individual saddles. There's two grub screws here which you can use to screw up or down to raise or lower the saddle to get the string action right, so how high it is off the frets. And also you can, because you can adjust the saddles individually, you can get them to match the radius of the fingerboard. So if you've got a vintage Strat with a like 7.5 inch radius, you're going to want more of a curve on it. If you've got something more modern like a 9.5 inch radius, you're probably going to have a flatter curve here, so it's a more consistent action across the fingerboard. These should be set to the same height on both sides. I've seen people when they're trying to get the action or the setup on the guitar, and these end up actually at an angle that way. No, these each individual one is flat, but they're going from, this is quite low, this is a little bit higher, and then going a little bit lower down here to match the radius of the fingerboard. There's some screws in here which you can use to wind each individual saddle backwards or forwards. That shortens or lengthens the string so you can get the intonation set up right. Like I say, very adjustable, very versatile, and an absolutely classic piece of design. In terms of performance, this has got a bit more to it than the Bigsby. You can still get those subtle vibrato effects. But it's got a lot more travel on the bar, so I can get some fairly extreme type of movement out of the trem. Now, some people will tell you there was a problem with this type of guitar, or certainly with this type of trem, that tuning stability is an issue. Yeah, it kind of is, or it can be, but as with so many things on the guitar, it's made or broken by the setup, and there's things you can do with setup to minimise or even reduce the problems of tuning stability. Now, the idea that when you use the tremolo system you're going to knock strings out of tune, that is a possibility, but if you're not set right, you've got the strings around the tuners, everything's kind of nicely set up, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's an incredibly versatile unit, and to be honest, I'd say if you went to your local music store, if you counted up the different types of trem in each type of guitar, this is probably the most prevalent. And this sort of unit, it can be set up what we call floating, so I've got downward movement and upward movement. So if I want to raise the pitch of a note, got a little bit of upward movement there, not tons but enough for me. And certainly in the downward movement there's a lot more range than there is with the Bigsby, and you can do sort of the strings flopping all over the body quite nicely. Probably more than you'd need, to be honest. So that's the Strat trem. Actually, something's called a vintage trem because the design here, this is as was used on the vintage guitars back in the 1950s. I mentioned earlier that it's been through a few little evolutions and a few different things have changed over the years. Let's take a look at something a little bit more modern on a USA standard Strat. Okay, so this guitar has got a more modern incarnation of the Strat trem. At first glance it looks the same, but if we take a closer look we'll see there are a few differences. Okay, so the big difference you see with this system over the vintage Strat trem is rather than the 6 individual screws, you've got the 2 posts here, and it's more of a knife edge type of pivot mechanism. You can adjust the overall height by screwing these up or down to raise or lower the trem system, but to be honest you generally don't need to do any adjustment there because you have got the little grub screws in the saddles like you've got on the vintage Strat trem, so you can adjust the height of individual saddles to get the string action right and just get it to kind of match the radius of the guitar fingerboard. As with the vintage Strat trem, screwdriver adjustment here for changing the intonation, so that you wind the saddle forwards or backwards to shorten or lengthen it to get the intonation dialed in. Something that's on this particular system is we've got the solid saddles rather than the bent metal ones. Some people will argue that this type of saddle gives you better sustain or better tone because there's more metal there. It's purely subjective.
I'm seeing these being used less on the modern Fender systems now, and they're using the bent metal ones a little bit more. I don't particularly have a preference one way or another, to be honest. If you do want to change, the one thing to be aware of, this particular system, the screw for the intonation adjustment goes in here, and it's actually off center, and the screw for the intonation adjustment goes through the block here. You'll find some aftermarket ones where the adjustment screw actually goes through the middle. It's in a similar alignment to what you had on the vintage Strat Trem. So if you want to do a swap of saddles, make sure that the ones you're replacing with are going to line up properly with where the adjustment screw is on your existing Trem.
So this guitar, like I say, is the Fender USA Standard Strat. Generally speaking, the two-post style Trem Fender tend to use on the higher end guitars, specifically like the American-made guitars. Although I noticed the new range of Fender Player Strats, I think it's called the Player. It's the successor to the or the replacement for the made in Mexico standard guitars. Now have two-post Trems as well. Personally, for a Strat, I actually prefer the 6-screw vintage style Trem. It's just personal preference. Even though this is technically better, I think on a Strat the traditional style Trem works better. But it's just a matter of personal taste. The key difference though between this Trem and the traditional Trem is this two-post knife edge design. Much more movement in the Trem, so I've got more extreme range of pitch variation. But again, there's the risk of tuning stability issues if your guitar's not set up quite right, because you've got these potential points of friction. Back in the 80s though, somebody tried to address that issue and did so rather well. A guy called Floyd, and he came up with a tremolo that looks like this. This guitar has got the Floyd Rose system on it. This is actually a Schaller Floyd Rose. Schaller build these under license from Floyd Rose. It's the basic design, but it's got a couple of little tweaks which I actually prefer. So when Floyd Rose designed this type of system, two objectives. One was tuning stability, because I mentioned that the Stratocaster Trems, sometimes if you haven't got your guitar set up quite right, if you use the Trem quite heavily, the strings can go out of tune. So trying to address that, and also the performance on this sort of Trem is much better. You've got more range in terms of how far up or down in pitch you can move the notes, move the pitch of the strings when you're playing them. First thing you notice when you look at a Trem like this, down here at the nut, instead of the traditional nut, we've got what we call a locking nut, so it removes any points of friction, which is where you've got vulnerabilities for tuning stability. There's all the points of friction around tuning pegs, and through the nut is removed. The strings are actually clamped in place here once the guitar's tuned up to pitch. And down at the body end, the ball ends are cut off the strings, and the strings are clamped in place into the blocks on the bridge here, so there's less chance of slippage and the strings going out of tune. Let's take a closer look at this in some more detail. Okay, so the Floyd Rose system, you can't adjust the height of the individual string saddles the way that you can on the Strat Trems. But what you have got is these two posts here. You can adjust them for the overall height. So you've got the general radius is set on the height. These saddles are towards the middle, a little bit higher than the saddles on the outside edges, so it matches the radius of the fingerboard, but you can't fine tune that. In terms of intonation, there's a little hex screw here. You slacken that off, and then you've got the ability to just slide this forwards or backwards to shorten or lengthen the string so you can get the intonation right. Stringing a Floyd Rose, like I said, there's no ball end on the string. You cut the ball end off, you slacken this off here, that moves back. This little block is free. You can then push the string down and then tighten this back up and fasten it tight with the Allen key. Don't over tighten it though, because you can split that block if you're not careful. And these little wheels here are fine tuners. You've got the locking nut down the end, so you can't actually use the tuners to tune the strings. Tuning stability on a Floyd is generally really good, but if you've got any little variations in tuning, so the guitar gets too hot, a little bit warmer, a little bit colder, and the string tension changes, you can just fine tune the
the strings with these fine tuners here. Just push these little things down ever so slightly, or let them up ever so slightly, enough just to you tune them. You probably get maybe half a semitone or so. Actually, no, probably more, probably about a semitone total movement up or down there. So you're plenty enough to be able to fine tune it once it's clamped down at the headstock end.
So very well designed, well engineered piece of equipment. There's a lot of range on a system like this, as I said, and something you'll often see on guitars with Floyd Rose systems is some wood routed away behind the tremolo. That's because the way the knife edge works, you're actually able to pull the trem quite a way back. To get some fairly extreme upward motion, and there's more than enough downward movement, like you can see, strings hanging off the body. So that's the Floyd Rose system, and sort of in terms of engineering, it's the best system that we've looked at. Now, I should say that this is the best tremolo system. It depends, it's all horses for courses. Like I said, on a Strat, I'd much rather have the vintage Trem than the technically better two-post Trem. For a rock guitar, for playing metal, something like that, the Floyd Rose is brilliant. Something else people don't always think about so much with the Floyd is the amount of metal that you've got compared to like a vintage Trem. It all helps with the sustain. I had a guitar years ago, came with a vintage Trem, like the Strat style Trem we were looking at before. I had that uprated and replaced it with a Floyd Rose system, and instantly the guitar sounded better because there's so much metal here. It was all adding to the mass, and the sustain and the tone of the guitar was so much better. To be honest, it sounds like an odd thing to say. I would consider playing a hardtail Floyd. Don't want to use it necessarily as a whammy bar, but just having all that extra mass there improves the sound of the guitar. The thing with Floyds, I find, for all the very, very good, and I've had so many Floyd equipped guitars over the years. I've had this custom guitar for a very, very long time, and I specified it with the Floyd Rose, and I don't regret it. It works very well. One thing I find with them is they're a little bit too big, a little bit ugly to my eyes. And there's a tremolo system which, to be honest, I much prefer, and I think it's a really good compromise between the Strat style Trem and the Floyd Rose, and it's one I'm going to look at now, made by Wilkinson. And it's a Wilkinson Trem on this Williams Evo Artist. This is actually it's Wilkinson design. This is actually a Goto made Trem, the V100N, and I think this is a beautifully designed, beautifully engineered, possibly the best designed and engineered piece of hardware I've seen on a guitar. I absolutely love it. Like the Floyd, like the modern Strat Trem, it's a two-post system, so you've got all the range for movement of the strings and changing the pitch of the strings that you've got with those other tremolo systems. But I much prefer it. It's a much more compact design, not as aesthetically jarring as the Floyd. It's not a locking system, just a regular nut here. This is a graphite nut, rake back headstock, staggered tuners. So the tuning stability is actually really, really good. I've got locking tuners on here as well, so there's one less point of friction, and I just think it looks nicer, it performs really, really well. And in terms of setup, there's a few little tricks here that make it, I think, a much, much better system. So let's take a closer look.
Now, there's loads of different things you can adjust on a Trem system like this, much more so than the Floyd. You've got the two posts here. You can adjust these for height with a little Allen key. Something very important I need to tell you about that though is you can't just go in, get the right size Allen key, don't just put it in there and turn it to take the posts up or down. Inside here there is actually another little screw, and that goes inside the post, and the idea is that is screwed down as far as it'll go inside to make contact with the guitar body. So something else to transfer vibration down into the guitar body. What you need to do is use a much smaller Allen key that comes with the Trem unit. Down in there, bring that grub screw up, and then you can use these posts to set the overall height of the tremolo system. and then once you've got that set, smaller Allen key in there and take that grub screw all the way down so it's making contact. And it's all about finding ways to get the vibration out of the tremolo system back into the guitar. It all improves the sustain and the tone. Unlike the Floyd system though, we've got some saddles here which are like the Strat Trem in that we've got a couple of grub screws we can use to adjust the height of the individual saddles. So that means you can adjust the height of the strings to match the radius of the fingerboard. So whereas the Floyd, you're kind of stuck with the camber that's on the, or the radius that's on the bridge as it comes. Here you can fine tune it to whatever radius neck that you've got, or whatever radius fingerboard you've got. Another important thing though is these screws here, these bolts, these lock the saddles in place. So if you're going to take the string height up or down, you need to slacken this off first, then adjust the string height, and then you can bolt that down to keep it in place. There's also a little screw in here for adjusting the intonation, for taking the overall thing forwards or backwards. So if you want to adjust the intonation, you adjust the length of the string. Again, slacken that off so you can move this, then Allen key in there, take this forward or back to adjust. Okay, so loads you can adjust on here, but there's more. There's a little grub screw here which you can tighten or loosen to adjust how the tremolo arm feels, and also there's a little screw at the bottom of this shaft. It's a screw-in arm, but there's a little thing that you can wind up or wind down to adjust how high or how low the tremolo arm sits in the block. So you can really fine-tune it so it feels just right for how you want the guitar to play.
So as you probably gathered, yeah, this is probably my favourite type of tremolo system of all the ones we've seen. There's a few that I haven't covered because I don't have examples of the sort of trem you might find on a Fender Jazzmaster or a Fender Jaguar, or things like the Gibson Vibrola. I don't have them to hand, but there's plenty of references out there online if you want to go and have a look for those. What we've covered here is kind of like the main ones. This Goto Wilkinson V100N is probably almost definitely my favourite. Is it the best though? Well, it's not a case of being the best, it's a case of being the best for the job. As a high performance, well engineered, general purpose trem system, I think this one wins hands down. If I wanted to play sort of extreme, using extreme whammy effects, the Floyd Rose is probably the way to go. If I had a vintage Strat, I wouldn't dream of putting one of these onto a vintage style guitar, even a copy of a vintage guitar. I just think the look and the feel of the traditional Strat Trem on a vintage style Strat is better. So it depends on the type of guitar and sort of music that you're wanting to play. You know, if you're wanting to get into playing rockabilly, rock and roll, you're not going to buy a guitar with a Floyd Rose on it. Likewise, if you're wanting to play Eddie Van Halen type dive bombs, you're not going to get a guitar with a Bigsby on it. Really, you need to look at sort of guitars that the guitarists that you want to emulate. Look at the sort of guitars that they play, what kind of tremolo systems do they use, and kind of understand the strengths and weaknesses of the different systems that I've shown you in this video. Think about how they'd work for the styles of music that you want to play. There's no right or wrong answer for what is the best trem. It's the case of it being the right tool for the job, and the type of job that you're doing will kind of influence what the right tool is, if you see what I mean. Okay, that's all for now. Hopefully you found that useful. If you did, please click like down there. If you really found it useful and you want to see other videos that I post on the channel, then the subscribe button down there, click on that and you'll be notified when I post any new content. If you've got a question about this video or anything else to do with music theory, guitar playing, guitar equipment, anything like that, then if you go here, there's a form that you can fill and send your question in. I'll try and get around to answering it as soon as I can. You can leave a comment down there if you want, but to be honest, I don't always see comments that get left on YouTube videos, so if you ask a question I might go and see. That form's a more reliable way to get in touch with me. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video sometime soon. Bye for now.